My spoiled sister destroyed my life over her divorce. But a year later, I discovered the truth behind what really happened. I'm 29 now, but this all started 7 years ago when my life was completely turned upside down after my family kicked me out of the house. I was 22 then, fresh out of college and starting my first job at a small local marketing firm. To save money before moving out, I was living at home with my parents. The job market was brutal, and entry-level pay wasn't exactly conducive to independent living, especially in our pricey suburban area. My parents seemed to understand this arrangement, at least until my sister Hannah upended everything. Let me give you a glimpse into our family dynamic. Hannah is now 37, which makes her 15 years older than me. We were never particularly close growing up. The age gap was simply too big to bridge. By the time she was heading off to college, I was still learning to tie my shoes. When she got married to Pete at 27, I was just a kid at her wedding, barely old enough to sip champagne during the toast. It wasn't until much later that I found out I wasn't exactly part of my parents' plan. They had Hannah young, and she was their perfect firstborn. Smart, musically gifted, and ticking every box on their list of expectations. Then I came along, an unexpected surprise that disrupted their carefully laid-out future. Don't get me wrong. They cared for me, made sure I had what I needed, but there was always this unspoken comparison. Hannah was the golden child, and everything I did was held up against her achievements. Any success of mine was measured by how it compared to hers, and my choices were always weighed against what she would have done. From the outside, her marriage to Pete looked flawless. Pete was a successful dietitian who ran his own practice, had the community's respect, and seemed completely devoted to Hannah. At their wedding, his vows moved everyone to tears. He spoke about how she was his soulmate and how he'd spend every day trying to be worthy of her love. They had 3 great years together before everything blew up. It all came crashing down on a Tuesday night when Hannah showed up at our parents' house in tears, mascara streaking her face. Between sobs, she announced she was filing for divorce, claiming Pete had been cheating on her for 6 months. She described finding suspicious texts, emails, and evidence of secret meetings, all the classic signs of infidelity. And here's where I got caught in the crossfire. The woman Hannah accused Pete of cheating with was Emily, a friend of mine from college. Emily had gone to Pete for professional advice about gaining weight for her amateur boxing career. She'd always been naturally slim and wanted to build muscle mass. I'd introduced them, thinking it was harmless, never imagining it would come back to haunt me. The whole thing felt off from the start. Emily wasn't the type to chase after married men. She'd been with her boyfriend since freshman year, and Pete always seemed like the kind of guy who wore his love for Hannah on his sleeve. But my parents didn't hesitate. They immediately took Hannah's side. She was their golden child, after all, and her word was treated like gospel. What hurt the most wasn't just that they believed her. It was how quickly they turned on me. Hannah spun this elaborate story about how I must have known about the affair and helped cover it up. Why else would I introduce them? Before I knew it, my parents were kicking me out of the house, accusing me of ruining Hannah's marriage. They barely gave me time to pack, throwing my belongings into suitcases and garbage bags. I'll never forget the look in my mom's eyes as she slammed the door, like I was a stranger, someone she'd never loved. There I was, a 22-year-old sobbing on the street, with nowhere to go and my own parents threatening to call the cops if I didn't leave. Thankfully, I had friends to lean on. My college roommate Mark took me in, giving me a place to stay until I could get back on my feet. I tried everything to reconnect with my family, called them until my phone died, sent countless texts, even showed up at their door a week later, but all I got in return were threats and cold shoulders. Confused and desperate for answers, I started digging. Emily was horrified when I told her what Hannah had accused her of. She showed me pictures of herself with her longtime boyfriend, now fiancé, proving she'd been in a committed relationship the entire time. She couldn't believe anyone would think she'd break up a marriage, especially since she'd only met Pete 4 times, all during professional consultations at his office during business hours. As for Pete, he completely vanished. He blocked my number, moved his practice to a different location, and wiped himself off social media. My parents and Hannah may as well have disappeared too. I later found out they changed their phone numbers, probably to ensure I couldn't contact them. With no other choice, I focused on rebuilding my life. I found a tiny studio apartment in a sketchy part of town, threw myself into work, and started piecing together something resembling a future. Fast forward to today. I'm 29, engaged to an incredible woman named Liza, living in a lovely apartment, and finally feeling like my life is on solid ground. Over the years, I worked my way up at the marketing firm, made some smart investments, and started freelancing on the side. Liza, a brilliant and compassionate pediatrician, is everything I could have dreamed of in a partner. We met at a charity event 2 years ago and recently announced our engagement on Facebook, sharing the usual happy couple posts. That's when the truth finally came out. Out of nowhere, I received an anonymous email that changed everything. Turns out, Liza knew Pete through a medical conference, and he'd seen our engagement announcement. The email contained everything. The truth I'd been desperate to uncover for years. It started with an apology from Pete himself, though it was anonymous at first. He explained that he couldn't stay silent any longer after seeing that I'd finally found happiness. He felt he owed me the truth about what really happened, even if it came far too late. Pete revealed that Hannah's story about his supposed affair with Emily was a complete fabrication. She'd spun the entire thing to cover up her own infidelity. Apparently, Hannah had been cheating on Pete with one of her coworkers, a man named Todd, for over a year before she filed for divorce. Pete had found out about the affair when he accidentally saw incriminating messages on her phone. Confronting her about it had been pointless. She denied everything at first, then broke down and admitted to it. But instead of taking responsibility, Hannah decided to get ahead of the situation by creating a diversion, a scapegoat to shift the blame entirely onto Pete. That's where Emily and I came in. Pete explained that when Hannah learned I'd introduced Emily to him for consultations, she saw the perfect opportunity. She crafted the story about Pete's alleged cheating and made sure my parents believed every word of it. By making me part of the narrative, she could reinforce her lies, knowing full well that my parents would side with her no matter what. Pete also admitted he didn't fight back against the accusations because he was exhausted and emotionally broken by the whole ordeal. Hannah's betrayal had gutted him, and facing off against her and my parents felt like a losing battle. To make things worse, she'd threatened to drag his name through the mud publicly if he tried to expose her. She knew he valued his reputation as a respected dietitian, so she used that leverage to silence him. He chose to walk away quietly, relocating his practice and starting over in another city. Reading Pete's email left me shaking with anger and disbelief. All those years of pain, rejection, and isolation from my family had been based on a complete lie. My parents had thrown me away like trash, all because they blindly believed Hannah's deceit without questioning anything. Liza, bless her, immediately urged me to reach out to Pete directly. She helped me craft a reply, and within hours, Pete and I were on a video call. He looked older and more tired than I remembered, but there was genuine remorse in his eyes. He apologized repeatedly for not standing up for me back then, explaining that he was so focused on surviving his own heartbreak that he didn't realize the full extent of the damage Hannah had done to me. Pete also provided evidence to back up everything he'd said. Copies of text messages, emails, and even a timeline of events that lined up perfectly with what I remembered. It was undeniable proof of Hannah's betrayal and manipulation. The next step was confronting my family. Liza supported me every step of the way, encouraging me to finally seek closure. I called my parents first, and for the first time in 7 years, they answered. The conversation was tense and awkward, but I didn't hold back. I laid out everything Pete had told me, sent them the evidence, and demanded an explanation for how they could have abandoned me so easily. At first, they were defensive, insisting they'd done what they thought was right based on the information they had. But as I pressed on, their excuses began to crumble. My mom broke down in tears, apologizing for not listening to my side of the story all those years ago. My dad was quieter but eventually admitted they'd been wrong to turn their backs on me without proof. They seemed genuinely regretful, but the damage was already done. Hannah, on the other hand, was a different story. When I confronted her, she doubled down on her lies, refusing to admit to anything even when presented with undeniable proof. She accused me of trying to ruin her life and claimed Pete was just trying to get revenge on her. It was clear she had no intention of taking accountability, so I walked away, finally done with her toxic influence. It's been a whirlwind of emotions since then. Anger, sadness, relief, and a strange sense of closure. My parents have been trying to rebuild our relationship, but it's hard to let go of the pain they caused. Liza has been my rock through it all, reminding me that I've built a good life for myself despite everything. Looking back, I realize how far I've come. My sister's lies may have ruined my life for a time, but they didn't define me. I rebuilt myself from the ground up, and I'm stronger for it. Now, as I prepare to marry the love of my life, I can finally close the door on that chapter and move forward with a clean slate. A real account of what unfolded 7 years ago completely turned my world upside down when the truth finally surfaced, along with undeniable proof. Turned out that Hannah was the one who cheated, not Pete. And here's the kicker, her affair wasn't with just anyone. It was with another friend of mine, Frank, who worked as a cashier at her local grocery store. When Pete caught them in the act, Hannah did what she always does best. She lied. She told Pete that I was involved, that I had been the one to introduce them, fully aware of what might happen. She wove this elaborate story about how I'd encouraged their connection because Frank was an aspiring singer and Hannah, with her good voice and experience in local theater, could supposedly help him with his career. Pete shared emails between Hannah and Frank that left no room for doubt. Love notes filled with their smug remarks about how they were fooling everyone. The evidence was irrefutable. Specific dates, times, places they met, and even plans they had made for after Pete inevitably found out. They were plotting to move in together and start a new life. But clearly, something went awry with their grand scheme. Once I confirmed that Pete was the one who'd sent me the email thanks to some careful detective work on social media, we arranged to meet in person at a coffee shop downtown. When I saw him, he looked older and more worn down, with gray hair replacing the youthful face I once knew. Still, there was a familiar honesty in his expression. He apologized for cutting me off back then, explaining that Hannah's accusations about my supposed involvement in their affair had left him feeling too hurt and angry to face anyone tied to that period of his life. But seeing my engagement announcement had stirred a sense of responsibility in him. He knew it was time to set the record straight. 2 days ago, Pete and I decided to confront my family in person. We showed up unannounced at my parents' house, which they still lived in. I'd confirmed with old neighbors beforehand that Hannah was living there too. Unsurprising, given her tendency to take the easy road. Free rent and home-cooked meals at Mom and Dad's must have been far too convenient to pass up. When Hannah saw us at the door, her reaction was priceless. All the color drained from her face, and she actually stumbled back into the hallway table. She must have known her elaborate web of lies was about to unravel. My mom tried to shut the door in our faces, but Pete planted his foot firmly in the way. Years of pent-up anger seemed to give him the courage I'd never seen in him before. We laid everything out in the living room. The affair with Frank, the intricate lies she concocted to cover her tracks, and even the way she swindled our grandmother's diamond ring from Pete during the divorce settlement because she couldn't afford to pay him otherwise. That last revelation hit my mom especially hard. That ring was meant to stay in the family, passed down through generations. My parents were horrified. For once, Hannah had no way to talk her way out of it. The evidence was overwhelming, and Pete's calm but detailed account of discovering her betrayal left them no room to defend her. My dad, who had always treated Hannah like she could do no wrong, looked like he'd aged a decade in a matter of minutes. He immediately packed up her belongings and kicked her out. Poetic justice, considering what they'd done to me all those years ago. But of course, the drama wasn't over. The very next day, Hannah tracked down my address and showed up at my door, crying and ranting about how I had ruined her life. When I refused to let her in, she resorted to scrawling the word monster across my front door with a marker. Real mature behavior for someone in her late 30s who's supposed to be a high school teacher. Explaining that to my neighbors was just a cherry on top of the entire ordeal. My parents have been trying to worm their way back into my life since then, casually mentioning their intention to attend my wedding as though the past 7 years had never happened. No apologies, no accountability, just the assumption that I'd welcome them back with open arms. They even sent a long text preaching about how family should stick together and how everyone makes mistakes. Funny how that sentiment didn't apply when they threw me out onto the street. Hannah, meanwhile, has been calling me from different numbers, leaving tearful voicemails about how I've ruined her life and how she can't afford to survive on her teacher's salary without my parents' support. The irony of her ranting about forgiveness isn't lost on me. And here's the kicker. My parents are now letting Hannah stay with them again and have invited me and Liza over for dinner to sort out our differences before the wedding. They honestly think they can fix 7 years of betrayal and abandonment with a family dinner and some small talk over lasagna. But I've learned my lesson. I don't need their forgiveness, their presence at my wedding, or their warped definition of family. 7 years ago, they showed me exactly where I stood, and I'm better off without them. The family I've built for myself, Liza, my close friends, and even my reconnection with Pete, means infinitely more than their conditional love ever could. Liza has been my rock through all of this, and we're planning our wedding for next spring. The process has been so much smoother without the weight of family drama looming over us. Liza understands the pain of rebuilding yourself, having lost her own parents in a car accident during her residency. We're even talking about starting a family of our own someday, and you can bet we'll do things differently, no favorites, no lies, and no conditional love. As for Hannah, she's free to keep playing the victim with my parents. I'm done being their scapegoat. The truth has finally come to light, and karma has done its work. Sometimes, the best revenge isn't taking action. It's letting the truth speak for itself. Thank you for listening to my story. I'd love to hear your thoughts, so please share them in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like this one.